Was the most famous man on earth during my childhood. Not just the most famous man in America, almost certainly the most famous man on earth, perhaps rivaled by the Pope and no one else. And when I was a kid growing up in suburban New York, he was a fascinating figure. He was not just the heavyweight champion of the world. He was this guy who kind of broke the rules of race in America, broke the rules of religion, spoke out against the Vietnam War at a time when nobody else was speaking out about it. So he became this symbol of rebellion, but at the same time, he was so popular. That was so strange. I think it was hard for me as a kid to understand it. But then when I got older and enough time had passed that I could, put his story in perspective a little bit and see how he fit into the country's history, it occurred to me that it was an amazing story and that it had really never been told as a biography. He had not yet received the big, serious cradle to grave biography that he deserved. And I set out to try to write that. Ali was magnetic. Everybody loved him. He was funny. He was smart, and he couldn't say no to people. He lit up every room he ever walked in. But he also had, a streak of rebellion in him a mile wide. He loved to challenge authority, and that's what I think made him so fascinating. He wanted to be loved, and he wanted to be a rebel, and that's unusual. Most rebels, want to change the world. That's their, clear goal, and they don't care if they make enemies along the way. Ali wanted to have it both ways, and that balancing act, that dance, made him, just fascinating to me. Wow, I think I was most surprised by the fact that despite his massive ego, he remained really humble in a way. He always, he struggled as a kid with dyslexia. His father was abusive, and he never, no matter how rich and famous he got, never felt like he was better than anybody else. And that's really extraordinary. And it took me a while to figure that out because he was such a gigantic figure, because he was so, sort of full of himself at times and bragging all the time. But he loved people and he saw them all as his equals. He didn't see why it would be unusual to spend a lot of time with a stranger who came up to him for an autograph, to invite that person over for dinner. He never got that kind of air about him that a lot of celebrities do. So I think that humility that remained with him was maybe the biggest surprise. There were unpleasant surprises along the way too. I was unpleasantly surprised at how he treated women and how he treated his wives in particular. But I'll try to focus on the pleasant surprises. He made a lot of people happy because he was just so open to meeting new people and genuinely interested in their lives. A Baptist, and his mother went to church every Sunday, and he never really took to it. He always wondered why Jesus was depicted as a white man, and why um, the church seemed to be geared toward a white religion. He viewed it as a white religion, and he felt like if God created everybody equally, why were Black people treated so differently? And then as a teenager, he discovered this organization called the Nation of Islam, which was which had adapted some of the principles of Islam, traditional Orthodox Islam, and made it into kind of their own um, ethnocentric, Black supremacist, Black separatist, um, some would say cult, others would say religion. And Ali really took to it because it addressed a lot of the issues that concerned him as a child. The Nation of Islam said that Black people shouldn't wait for white people to grant them their rights. They should just seize their rights. They should set out to build their own communities, build their own businesses, don't rely on the white man, and eventually build their own nation. And Ali really took to that. He viewed the prophet, he viewed Elijah Muhammad as a prophet. Elijah Muhammad was the leader of the Nation of Islam, and Ali believed that he was speaking for God, and took that very seriously. So he changed his name after becoming a member of the Nation of Islam. Originally, he was going to call himself Cassius X, just as Malcolm Little changed his name to Malcolm X. But Elijah Muhammad wanted to grant him a special name to show his special place within the organization, and decided to call him Muhammad Ali instead of his. Of course, he was born Cassius Clay Jr. Ali was drafted. At first, he was declared ineligible for the draft because his IQ tests were so low. Mostly, I'm sure, because he had dyslexia. But after the rules changed and the cutoff was lowered, he became eligible. And at first, he just said he didn't want to fight. He didn't think that the war was right. He didn't think we should go over to Asia and kill innocent people there. He didn't see why Black people should fight for America when America treated them as second-class citizens. And then he began to talk about it from a religious standpoint. He said that the Nation of Islam forbade people from participating in secular wars, that they could only fight in a holy war, and that this was not a holy war for the Muslims. So he refused to fight, and as a result was convicted of draft evasion and sentenced to 5 years in prison. And he appealed that, but even while he was appealing, he was banned from boxing, stripped of his title, had his passport taken away, so he couldn't fight outside the country, and for 3.5 years, lost, probably what would have been the best 3.5 years of his career. Boxing skills were unusual. It was rare to see a heavyweight fighter who could move as quickly as he did. He had an astonishingly quick jab, which helped him keep fighters away. And he moved like a middleweight or even like a lightweight. He was just so quick, and he had a great ability to dodge punches. Some of it was just instinctive. He just seemed to know where the punches were going to land, and was able, he described it as just being able to move his head the tiniest fraction of an inch. And he couldn't explain how he did it, but he managed to avoid a lot of damage. So it was this combination of speed and power that made him really unique. Of course, when he came back after 3.5 years outside the ring, when he was exiled from boxing, he was not as fast, and he began to absorb more punishment. He began to get hit a lot more, and we could see how that damage was causing him brain damage in the long run. But in the short run, he was able to get by because he turned out to have a great ability to take a punch. He could absorb damage without being seriously hurt, without being knocked out. So the second half of his career, he really relied more on guile, less on speed, and he proved that he was a great strategist. Unfortunately, there was a price to pay for that when it came to the neurological damage that he was doing. First of all, sports are great because they're full of action. There are people who are putting their lives on the line, or at least, challenging themselves, pushing themselves to the limit of their abilities. But biography in general is a neat way to look at world history. By looking at one person, you may you're vulnerable to bias, of course, but a person's life is a great way of looking at history in a way that is more relatable for readers. I'm not a trained historian, I'm a journalist, but I think that a great way to understand our history, and a way that is more approachable sometimes, is to look at one life and to try to look at how history shaped that life and how that life shaped history. And when you do that successfully, I think you find this sweet spot. It's a story that's both really informative as well as really entertaining, and I think that for me is what I'm trying for. Is one of the most important figures in the 20th century when it comes to civil rights and Black rights in America. You can look at the progress, the evolution in this country. You can look at what people like Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois did to raise a consciousness about Black rights in the early part of the century, and what fighters like Jack Johnson did, and then ball players like Jackie Robinson. Sports was a great way of testing a lot of these political theories, because people who weren't ready to change laws saw that Black athletes and Black entertainers were changing culture, and the laws would catch up. So if Jackie Robinson proved that Black people could play baseball with white people, and if Muhammad Ali proved that Black people could stand up and speak out for themselves in sports, then suddenly it became more difficult to defend the laws that were discriminating against Black people. So I think Americans are more receptive to change when they see these brave figures challenging the status quo, and then you start to see the pressure building on lawmakers to legitimize, to legalize some of those changes. With Ali and with a lot of other famous men and women, we tend to celebrate them to the point that we ignore their flaws, and I think that's a mistake. We turn our heroes into superheroes. We turn them into, you know, these cartoon figures, and I think it's important to remember that our heroes don't have to be perfect. I really wanted to show that Ali was brave and brilliant, but he was also flawed. He was stupid when it came to managing his money. He treated women very poorly. He turned his back on friends like Malcolm X. I believe he could have possibly saved Malcolm X's life and chose not to. So I wanted to create an accurate, nuanced image of Ali. I wanted to give people a sense that he was human. Because if we expect our heroes to be perfect, then nobody's ever going to try to be heroic. Ali is one of the most important figures in American culture for the 20th century. He forces us to confront the atrocities of the Vietnam War. He forces us to confront our own racism. He introduces Islam to many Americans. You know, this is a religion that's almost completely unknown in America into the middle of the 20th century. And Ali, when he changes his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, the reaction among most Americans is, "What kind of a name is that?" Even though it's quite a common name in much of the world. So I think he changes American culture as much as anyone I can think of from his era. I believe Ali was the most important sportsman of his time. I think certainly in America. I'm not sure if there were any other figures worldwide because I'm American and I don't know football very well.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I still think that if you look at the whole world, if you look at Africa and Asia, and Ali was important everywhere. His emergence really excited people, especially in Arab countries, because they had never had an American speak up for them. And he spoke up for Black people in America. He spoke up for the underdog. He became a hero of the anti-war movement. So I think he touched on so many different lives and inspired so many different people for so many different reasons, um, even that go far beyond his boxing. So it's hard for me to think of anybody who had that kind of an impact in the world. He had a ton of white friends, and he loved everybody. He didn't really think about it in terms of color, even though he was a member of the Nation of Islam, and they referred to the white people as the devil. But Ali did never embrace that view personally. His trainer was a white man, Angelo Dundee. His
yeah.
business manager, he had a lot of white friends. Howard Cosell, of course, the sportscaster, was one of the most important figures in Ali's life. So there was, even though he claimed that he was, a black separatist, and that he said he thought integration was wrong. He would be horrified if his children went to school or dated white people, but he ended up having, his children did marry white people, and he lived in neighborhoods that were mostly white. So he talked about racial separatism, but he did not live that way. The teachings of the Nation of Islam said that Black people were the better race, that white people were the devil, and that they should remain apart. As Ali often said, bluebirds go with bluebirds, and redbirds go with redbirds. And that was his philosophy. At least, and that's what he preached, but he didn't practice it. Absolutely. I interviewed hundreds of people for this book. I found, some of Ali's old classmates from his elementary school and from his high school. I found the girl who gave him his first kiss. And I interviewed business managers. I interviewed fighters. I interviewed fighters who had only sparred with him. I had just a great time interviewing people who traveled in Ali's orbit. Softened Ali in the public image. We've turned him into kind of this teddy bear. We know when he suffered from Parkinson's and could no longer speak, he became this sort of angelic figure, and we turned him into a bit of a saint. And I worry sometimes that we've softened him and lost sight of his radical nature. So it's gotten to the point where everybody loves Ali. He's on T-shirts, he's on posters, he's on billboards, and he's become kind of a this almost sainted figure, and it troubles me a little bit because I think we need to remember just how controversial he was. He was the most unpopular, man in white America for a long time, and now we've kind of forgotten that side of him. Was interviewing people about Ali, I was asking them sometimes about the meeting between Ali and King. They met twice, and people who knew both of them um, thought that the two men really hit it off. And I became curious about King and why why he and Ali hit it off. And I began asking more questions, and then I realized that at that point it had been 35 years since the last King biography had been written, and that was just astonishing to me. So I realized that there were dozens and dozens of people alive who still knew Martin Luther King. He would only be 94 if he were still alive today. So it's possible if he hadn't been assassinated that he might still be with us. So I decided to begin trying to interview everybody who knew Martin Luther King, and that became my quest for the last 6 years. And I interviewed dozens and dozens of people who knew him well, including some of his closest friends, family members, and I'm proud to say that I think this is maybe the last biography that you can write with living witnesses who knew Martin Luther King Jr. Normally somewhere between 3 to 5 years, and this one for King was 6 years. There's no getting those years back, so you better choose your subjects well. I make lunch for my wife so that she can work and make money.